Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Brad Roberts, the director of the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today to a talk by Paul Schulte from the United Kingdom on infodemics and information disorder, societal vulnerabilities of the body politic, and some difficult remedies. Before turning it over to Paul, let me just say a few words to help set the context. Some of you will recall that in November, our center convened a workshop on the topic of rethinking biosecurity strategy for the decade ahead. We were trying to take stock of some of the lessons of the response to the pandemic and to project out the kinds of challenges that might emerge in the decade ahead. And among the most interesting lines of argument that we opened up there was one opened up by our speaker today. And in my simple shorthand, he brought together two important but heretofore separate streams of discourse. One of those streams focuses on the impact of scientific knowledge, or its absence, on the strategic management of a pandemic. And the other discourse focuses on what Russia calls information confrontation in an era of what some refer to as societal warfare, modern warfare of a new kind, involving the manipulation of public and thus policy understanding, and thus of political will through the use of misinformation, malinformation, and disinformation. And in knitting together these two discourses, Paul helped us to think in new ways about the challenges confronting our societies in the pandemic and beyond. And shortly after his participation in our November workshop, Paul's thinking became prominent in a United Kingdom parliamentary debate about responses to the pandemic, which you can read about online. Paul is a retired senior UK career civil servant. He is also an honorary professor at Birmingham University and a senior visiting research fellow at King's College London. He writes and lectures on modern strategic conflict, on drones, on terrorism, on nuclear strategy, on disarmament, and military ethics. Paul and I first met decades ago. We probably shouldn't reflect on how many, Paul. But in the mid-1990s, when I was engaged in a research project aimed at calibrating the risks of mass casualty terrorism with chemical and biological warfare agents, and he was in the UK Ministry of Defense trying to make sense of the Gulf War syndrome. Many in the audience won't understand the reference to the Gulf War syndrome. This was a chronic and multi-symptomatic disorder that afflicted veterans of the Persian Gulf War of 1990 and 91. Paul went on to become the ministry's director of Proliferation and Arms Control, to become the Britain's member of the United Nations Commissions for Iraqi Disarmament. He was director of the defense organization in the Coalition Provisional Authority in Baghdad, and founding head of the UK's Interdepartmental Post-Conflict Reconstruction Unit. In 2000 and 2001, he was a fellow at Harvard University's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. Paul has a bachelor's in economics from the London School of Economics. He's also a graduate of the Royal College of Defense Studies Senior Officers course. And he is qualified and has formerly practiced as a group psychotherapist. Paul, thank you so much for making the time to do this. Before I turn it over to you, let me review the rules of engagement for the group. Paul is going to speak for 30 to 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. If you would like to join that discussion, please either raise your hand electronically or send me a message in the chat function. Paul, thanks so much. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for attending. Good morning and good afternoon. you've heard the description of the topic. So next slide, please. I'm trying to be dispassionate. I'm going to be limited. I'm going to in examining what we are all in, information dynamics and complexities around COVID-19. But some of the anxieties and accusations have been familiar since about 2016, the Brexit referendum and the US election then. And Brad reminds me of Gulf War syndrome, which I worked on quite extensively, painfully in the MOD. Some of the dynamics of there are the same. I think that was an early precursor infodemic, but we didn't have the term. And I'm going to be quite image heavy because I think that's how I want to produce ideas juxtaposed with images, because I think that's richer. But it is the way that information disorder is propagated and it's experienced in color and in simplified imagery. I'm going to try, I'm not going to pretend to be a medical person, and I'm not going to second guess government decisions about handling the epidemic. And I'm going to try very hard to be not to be partisan and political, especially about trespassing into American territory, which I see as strewn with minefields at the moment. So next slide, please. So what I'm going to give is a snapshot since November 2020, when I was asked to prepare some evidence for the Parliamentary Committee on National Security Strategy, looking at biosecurity. It's in these few months, and of course the picture will change again. And I can't go into great detail and definition in only 30 minutes. So really, this is a transmission test. Do you generally, is this pattern that I'm describing what you see? Are the aspects I've got wrong? Is the more off screen? And I'm looking, I realize, and I'm quite okay with, just a small part of the territory. I'm looking at national security and diplomacy aspects of infodemics. And so if you accuse me of securitizing this or of sino-Russophobia, I sort of expect that because I think it emerges from the material. But I note that there are other lenses to look at this complex human phenomenon, and they matter because if there are going to be solutions which work in the security and the diplomatic domain, they're going to have to take account of those other dimensions, even though they might not be tightly driven by them. Next, please. So we are in the middle, I hope you've noticed, we are in the middle of not only of a pandemic, but of an infodemic. And that's not my term, that comes from the World Health Organization. It's an overabundance of information, right and wrong, and it can be harmful. It can kill you. It can threaten all sorts of health gains and just behavior which is medically unwise in terms of dominant understandings. And so I show Herman Cain, who is a very impressive human being, who I think died as a result of mistaken interpretation of the evidence. So he was a victim of the pandemic, but his public statements may have contributed to the infodemic, which gives. So he was both he was victim, but also part of the problem, which is not to diminish the human loss, but it's to remind us that we all play complex parts in this. Now, the World Health Organization called for cooperation and national action plans against infodemics, and I think they're being prepared. I haven't seen any yet, but it's had a lot of criticism for being unwilling to take a more determined line about China over the origins of COVID and the inability to come up with hard information for a long time. The US government, of course, was particularly critical. And my point is that the WHO's predicament is wider than just that organization. If it wants to go on working with strong or even adequate international cooperation, there are things it can't do and statements it can't make, otherwise it's a breakdown in the process. So that's the kind of complex but sympathetic initial judgment I want to suggest about the WHO. Next, please. Now, in writing my piece, I thought, well, this is important. We're talking about infodemics. Is there a way of studying them? And indeed, it turns out there is a science of infodemiology. And there was a conference on it last year, and you can see videos of bright-eyed, mostly young people who are infodemic managers for particular countries. And they come up with this sort of graphic, which is happy and high-minded, and it's kind of typical of the health and the social care sector. But my suggestion is that the constraints of running an international organization means that it's going to be very difficult to examine state disinformation and malicious interventions in infodemics. So let's keep that in mind. Next, please. The other concept I found very useful in all this was the idea of information disorder. Infodemics don't come out of nowhere. They come out of a situation where all of us are exposed to a great deal of information, some of which may be deliberately false, some just misled, and others maliciously intended to harm. So a very useful paper by Wardle for the Council of Europe put that together. Let's think of, so rather than say fake news, which is a sloppy and often misleading term, it enables people to wriggle out of what is actually meant. Let's think about misinformation, disinformation, which is certainly deliberate and fabricated, though when it's spread, one person's disinformation may become others' misinformation. And then there's malinformation, where the evidence you're producing may actually be originally true, though you got hold of it illicitly, and maybe you've changed some of it. But the context in which it's used is intended to do harm. That's typically the hack, leak, and dump. So next idea. Next slide. So information disorder has got a number of information aspects to it. But we have to remember it may be passionately believed, it's evolving, it may be poorly understood. And I put up Pepe the Frog because that's an example of a meme which has a different meaning at different times. It started as a sort of amiable San Francisco hippie cartoon, and it became appropriated by the right and disowned by its originator as a hate symbol. So that's irony poisoning, which can happen. Disinformation includes what is often called information warfare or active measures, or virtual societal warfare I shall come on to later. And typically it uses conspiracy theories and deliberate rumors to complicate and confuse and divide targeted societies. And malinformation can be part of an overall disinformation campaign. But there are just so many different shades in this. It is genuinely hard to know what one's dealing with. What is the motive for people to say what they're saying or spread on the web what they are spreading? How much is this delusion or anger or deceit or malice? Next, please. And this does bring us into this concept of societal warfare, the original phraseology, and then rapidly adapted to the idea of virtual societal warfare by Rand. So that we have to include the possibility that in this information disorder, within that is a pattern of hostile social manipulation, systematic purposeful generation to produce harmful outcomes in a targeted country. We normally think of this by states, and some states are thought to be particularly good at it, but it's not impossible that non-state actors could do it. The jihadis don't seem to be very interested or effective in indirect propaganda. They have apparently rather little to say about COVID, except that it's God's judgment and a wrathful punishment on crusaders. But I don't know what these other groups who might want to conduct virtual societal warfare will do, what they're good at, how they might want to spin their brand of virtual social warfare. Next, please. And we're in a situation of different infodemics. There's a very good summary of the COVID infodemic, the virus bringing together distinct streams, conspiracy theories, far-right extremism, political propaganda, foreign influence operations, and profit-driven fakery. Well, that was one torrent, she wrote last year. But then in the US, we've seen this interesting for us from outside, more painful for you, I think, this partial complements with another infodemic over the election. And sort of flaring up of a culture war, and they've come together, and the memes are kind of blended. The woman at the top is Ashley Babbitt, who is now been flagged up as a martyr for the white race, and she's even got a martyr flag. So that's appearing and somehow in a blend with anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers and anti-vaxxers. So one infodemic can merge strangely with aspects of another. Next, please. Now, why is this happening? Why are we where we are? Why is the 21st century so distressing? It wasn't meant to have turned out like this. And it seems to me that you can identify lots of postulated underlying causes, and often they're spread out on the left-right spectrum. Is it globalization and precarity and inequality and resentment, or is it bad education because people just don't get taught the skills to be critical? Is it to do with the polarization of political elites and commentators? Is it cultural Marxism, globalism? Is it dark money? This interesting phrase, the politics of contempt, is that part of what's doing it? Is it the acceptance of lying? Alternative facts, or what the Russians call vranyo, lies you tell when the other person knows that you're lying, and you know that he knows that you're lying, but you say it anyway because he can't stop you. And Obama made this point: there are now no more guardrails within the media ecosystem. Or is it just because the mainstream media is not doing its job, or its job has been driven by a search for profit? And then there's this very elegantly worked out surveillance capitalism critique. Why are we in this situation? Well, it's epistemic chaos. Why don't we all understand the same things? Why is our perspective so different and the facts we see so different? Well, it's algorithmic amplification, micro-targeting, corrupt information, and this is all part of a rigged game. The idea of a free market for ideas producing truth doesn't work if the game is rigged. So there is a lot of writing on this, which feeds into an obsession with social media, which I think is probably overrated, but just irresistibly fascinating. Next, please. Now, but taking that critique further forward, when you look closely from a psychological point of view, there are a lot of important psychological mechanisms which come together, which produce division amongst heavy users of social media. So rather familiar phrases like cognitive dissonance, selective perception, fundamental attribution error, confirmation bias, and stereotyping. It's uncomfortable to deal with ideas and people and views which are different. So you move towards often by clicking on like or dislike, you move towards a filter bubble, or even a filter shroud, where you're with people who think differently, think similarly, and you almost don't see those who disagree. And then you're in echo chambers and chat rooms, and you may end up in a conspiracy theory. And there's a lot of depressing experiments on this, showing that falsehoods actually work better. They move faster, and they are more persistent, partly because, of course, the falsehoods which are taken up are what people want to hear and want to go on believing. And the problem is that if we are in a filtered bubble, we don't know how we got there, or what is keeping us there. It's the problem of algorithms and black boxes. And so this experience is opaque to us, though it can be very gratifying because of the filtering. And it's a reminder that actually people don't communicate so much as they think they do about transmitting information and ideas. It's actually representing and enacting shared belief a lot of the time. And you do that every time you like something on Facebook or Twitter. And the various tools are spreading. You can do online propaganda in various ways, and there are programs you can buy to produce fake identities and impersonate people, have public figures say things they never actually said or whatever have said, and that will look. They're getting better and better and cheaper to produce that. And just a few people who are very determined and or especially obsessional can produce disproportionate disinformation disorder. So from the psychological perspective of most of the researchers I've seen, this is very depressing. Next, please. And the ultimate idea of the sort of depressing projection of where this will go is in a classic article a few years back on MadComs. AI is going to become more and more important, and propagandists can draw on AI in their attempts to manipulate minds. So if you integrate AI into machine-driven communication tools and computational propaganda, you'll just get better and better at influencing people. You'll be able to do micro-messaging tailored around individuals' personalities who you will know more about, because every time you click on anything on social media, you give away things about yourself which are already being used for elections, and that was a big part of the British dispute over Brexit, that it was alleged that Cambridge Analytica had access to knowledge about people they didn't have about themselves, and so was able to target in the last few days very precise messages to people who would have been swing voters. And the idea that is put forward is that this is going to get better and better, and you would and that's the way politics will be exercised and dominated, unless somehow we get better at dealing with it. And so, for example, about COVID, there's an Australian writer who said, well, if there were mad comms functioning now as they could be, what would happen is an enemy state would see a crisis coming, would be beginning to analyze how that crisis, which could be a pandemic or it could be some aspect of climate change or an economic depression, would see how it would impact on that body politic and the social structure, and begin to see where the cleavages and the weaknesses were, and to start crafting messages which would reach those cracks and those headlines even before the people in the country were aware that the crisis was upon them. And then, of course, the narrative would develop as things developed. So that's a very ugly future. Part of what we're talking about is how we can avoid that. It may be an exaggeration. It's possible that AI working in the other direction can offset this, but it's there as a kind of reductio, Strange-Lovian reductio ad absurdum. Next, please. So what's to be done? Well, I find that there is an enormous proliferation of ideas about this. All these august institutions, RAND and Carnegie and the Council of Europe and the Swedish Defense Ministry are coming up with listings of ideas on this, and they're even mapping. There's a mapping of initiatives to measure initiatives. There's no sort of shortage of money, and I suspect, perhaps cynically, the money is coming from big tech, because it's a way of social media companies avoiding regulation. If they can say, look, there are these alternatives to doing it, it holds off that prospect which they desperately do not want. So I mean, I imagine people will want to come up with ideas, and I encourage that, but it's almost certain that in all these immensely long reports, those ideas will have been put down before, because a lot of smart people have been thinking about this for some years now. The key Council of Europe report was in 2017. Next. So good ideas keep coming up, better digital literacy. Well, that's always a good idea. Everybody likes that, but it takes a while, and I think that extremists could also get better at learning, and some schools will not want to teach it or teach it in a way which will lead good consensual liberal results. And a forced disclosure of social media algorithms, difficult in legal terms to pull off because it's proprietary, the ultimate proprietary information. Rapid AI takedown of bad information and closing accounts. Well, the prospect of that might cause a revolt. It's certainly authentically Orwellian. It gets you into the Twitter Trump dispute. Should private companies be able to decide on free expression? So that's a hard one. Even if AI could be clever enough to beat the AI of the disinformers, and that's of course not clear. And then you could do rapid rebuttal, which is part of politics. But the Swedes, who've been doing this for some years, say that this actually doesn't work very well because the other side likes it. They dispute your disputed facts, and the ideas just get smeared around. And in any case, a lot of disputes aren't about facts. They are about stories or values. And there is some further psychological evidence I won't go into that the mere examination of fake news, of disinformation, and its refutation doesn't always have the desired effect. It doesn't leave most people believing that there's true and there's untrue. It spreads a just general disbelief that anything is any better than anything else in terms of the quality of information. Next. Or you could have new institutions. Sweden's got a psychological defense agency, and they think it's a good part of modern total defense. And the Finns and the Balts are very good at this. But this may be to do with the fact they're quite cohesive and they're close to Russia, and they have historical memories or anxieties about Russia, which tends to concentrate social attitudes. And I've seen from the New York Times the idea that, well, maybe the US should have a truth czar. To look at this problem and try and deal with it. Well, let's see how that goes. I suspect it would be a subject of immense suspicion and denigration, because I think there's too little trust for it. But maybe one has to experiment. And the other magic panacea solution that comes up is, well, we need to heal our social divisions and hostilities, because that's what's making us vulnerable to information disorder. But of course, the trouble with that is, if we knew how to do it, then we would have done it anyway, because there are so many other good reasons why you'd want a more cohesive, better functioning, less acrimonious society. So that's not an easy way out. Next. Now, this I found genuinely interesting given my MOD background. The London Times said in November that the UK's NSA equivalent, cooperating with our 77s brigade, called PSYOPs, but it described itself as influence, had become involved working together against anti-vaccine disinformation in the same way they had against the Islamic State. And this was being coordinated in the Cabinet Office. But it was being done tastefully. It would only be allowed against state adversaries and not ordinary citizens. But the other interesting aspect is that it was apparently being done in some kind of concert with the other nations of the Five Eyes. So presumably either those countries are doing nothing, or they are committed to a similar effort with a similar combination of military and civilian technical expertise in the information area. And this is a big deal for Britain. We don't normally talk about this. So when it was announced to the Times, that was a deliberate government decision. I emphasized this in my evidence to the parliamentary committee and said, maybe you should ask more about this, because this is quite important and it's new. And I wasn't entirely surprised they didn't push that, and that there's been almost no further mention of this anywhere as far as I can see. And I've got conflicting views about that. As a scholar, I think that's frustrating, because I'd like to know more. As a citizen, I'm mildly concerned. As a former defense official, I can quite understand. I think it's a good thing to keep this classified and quiet, because there are so many problems if you start bringing complex stuff out into the open. But I think we might hear more about that. Next. And back to this point about social media. I mean, I'm suspicious of them as well. I think they're important. But they're so important. They make so much money that they have an enormous influence. And trying to mess with them is going to be difficult, worth doing. But don't depend on too much emerging, and don't think that that's going to solve the problem, because it's more, or at least as much, about political culture, which would have to change in ways we can all understand and yearn for, and we hear politicians say they want to do, but actually we've got no experience of that happening, and why would we think that it would now? So I think emphasis on social media may just be a sort of displacement activity, a distraction from the bigger set of problems. Next. Now, it's worth contrasting this with Russia and China, which is their problems with information disorder are quite much simpler, because they've got the sovereign internet law in Russia, and they can arrest people if necessary they have various crimes in the statute about it affecting the spiritual health of the Russian people, and all sorts of legal powers to block and delete what they want. And China has similar arrangements, but they have this interesting thing you can do if you have a lot of people on public security. They will invite you to come and drink tea. You'll get a visit if you've been putting up bad things on the internet or social media, or posting things, or even emails to other people which you don't think are going to be seen. You'll be invited around for a cup of tea. Would you please come around and drink some tea with us? And you will be told, we know what you're doing, and stop it. And your computer and flat will probably be searched, and you'll get a graduated warning. This won't just be tea next time. Next. Now, so that works for them, at least for the moment. It's brittle, things may go wrong, but at the moment, in terms of their media ecosystem, that's a good way of controlling information disorder. So now some conclusions and uncertainties. So our condition is endemic information disorder and periodic infodemics. But then who is we? I think one has to keep asking this question. Who are the we who are concerned about this? Because different audiences will have different concerns. I mean, I suspect that this is a highly educated, rather technocratic, science-friendly audience, maybe part of the globalizing elite. And so you're going to have we are going to have different feelings from other audiences. And maybe where we are is just the way liberal democracy has gone. This is how civil society will talk to itself using sensible electronic assistance. It's just the initial phase of informational civilization, but nobody knows what comes next. That's what I'm left with going into this. Will we habituate? Will we adapt, evolve with clever strategy? Or are we heading to MADCOM domination? But at the moment, strategically, our national ability in handling this discomfort is going to be a strategic factor. If you're judging national unity and determination in your own country or others, how will this play out? Maybe it won't have any effect at all, in which case that's a relative strategic bonus. But if you judge that you or others are prone to virtual societal warfare, then that's very important in assessing the future. And it's necessary to think that infodemics could erupt out in various ominous, ambiguous ways. Everybody's expecting a possible disease X, the next pandemic, and we've got climate change, which is going to generate a whole set of scenarios, each of which will be hard to agree on. Is it really climate change, or is it something else? And we should remember there have been quite successful fabrications in the past. The idea that and they've stuck around in the memory. Group therapists will think of the group matrix. In the group matrix of the world is a very successful KGB Operation Infection, saying that AIDS came out of American biolabs. And somewhere deeper in the world's memory is the Chinese concern, and Western Communist Party concerted set of allegations about US germ warfare in Korea. So these things don't go away. And some of the Russian propaganda at the moment is about activating those anxieties. Next, and as I shall show. So trying to round up, analyze at the moment in the middle of an infodemic, it seems to me at the moment, currently on the scorecard, authoritarian leaderships seem to be encouraged and emboldened by this. They at least think they're doing better than democracies. This factor is working in their favor, though they know they have underlying weaknesses and brittleness. But those very vulnerabilities seem to be intensifying this anxious, indefinite, structural, informational conflict between democracies and authoritarian systems, two world systems, because we each threaten, whether we're doing it deliberately or not, the other's claims, their self-confidence, their cohesion, their legitimacy. And even if we think that this is not deliberately concerted government interference, the Russians and Chinese tend to think that it is, and therefore they must redouble their own efforts. Well, we're not short, as I've said, of remedies. All those think tanks and the lawyers and the sociologists are working together in those august institutions to try and counter the scruffy hoodies probably working in basements generating disinformation. And there are ideas being thought through. The UK is coming up with an online harms bill, which is coming out. There's going to be EU legislation as well, all subject to ferocious lobbying from the social media companies and civil liberties groups. But it would all work better if we weren't having to introduce this in advance in the middle of a crisis. But all of them have problems, and what you think may bring about unity may be divisive and it may backfire. And what would all involves unnatural acts, democratic governments taking action to control and safeguard or modify their electorates' opinions. Next. And foreign influence comes up again and again. And my conclusion is that we, the general public or the academic public, do not know how much difference external information operations have made. They may have been marginal. Some of the earlier assessments about Brexit seem to be being wound back, and similarly the American election. But we just don't know. It's clear they haven't been huge, but we don't know what effect they've had. And it may be because this is just too politically sensitive to talk about. The way that from an academic perspective, you would do it is you'd look at metrics, you would examine what you know about the information operations being mounted, and you process trace the decisions that they were presumably aimed to influence. And you could see if they were achieving that. And they may not need to do it. It may be better not to do it because you may conclude it's more effective not to get involved, because what's happening anyway with the internally generated information order is bringing out about what you want. And it's better not to get caught doing it. But on the other hand, it may be just in a crisis where all the calculus is different. Then you may still be concluding, well, then let's try it as a military confrontation approaches. Now's the time to distract and paralyze enemy decision makers by talking about a plague or a false flag bio attack or something. And it's clear that even the suspicion of foreign interference is toxic and it galvanizes. Thomas Rid made this point at an Oslo conference this week, I think, that this is maybe how active measures achieve their key activation. It's activating the fear that foreigners are messing with us. So it's a global problem, but solutions are going to have to fit into very different ecosystems informationally and different countries. What works in one won't work in another. And then the changes that generates in turn will feed back and produce further differences between countries, particularly law, business law and regulations. Next. So further summings up, I think what we're seeing through information disorder flaring up is increased distrust at all levels. Maliciously competitive vaccine nationalisms exemplify this. Despite countries saying we're not going to get into this, they are. And this involves bogus warnings, which is going to lead to fewer people getting vaccinated at all or as quickly as they could. More people will die. This is the only way of mitigating or exiting this will require international cooperation. But to get those benefits, liberal democracies are going to have to live with obvious lies and expertly hostile disinformation, this attempted virtual societal warfare that we know is happening, which can be collected and publicized, but do nothing very much about it. Occasional rebuttals, the odd secret counterattacks which have not been ruled out. And so back to the WHO, its predicament of unillusioned silent acceptance is widely shared. Governments sort of know what is going on, but that silence at a time of intensified state competition or great power competition seems to be the only way that international arrangements or some international arrangements can be made to work. To crank up the volume of outrage is going to lead to the system breaking down, just refusal of cooperation from the people you're accusing. I think governments know that, but I'm not sure that's true of their publics, and that is going to be a problem. I think probabilistically, stochastically, that will be a problem because information infections can spread unpredictably and they can mutate. Next and last, I think. This is just a harvest from today's EU online disinformation digest, and it comes out every week. That's what's being said on Russian or Russian-sponsored media, that the non-Russian vaccines can be called a shot of death. A couple of weeks or months ago, Dmitry Kislyak was talking about the British vaccine will turn people into monkeys, and this on a prime Russian TV show. This is monkey vaccine. And in Armenia, they're being told that COVID-19 is a multi-purpose biological weapon. Back to the AIDS lie and scandal. And in all the Russian near abroad, similar narratives are unfolding about Sputnik versus the world. So that's part of the reality. We can discuss how serious it is, whether it really makes much difference, and we could discuss what methods we might use to stop or mitigate it. But we have no reason to think that it is going to stop. That is part of the background of ordinary individual social life and international relations. Thank you, and that's all. Final question slide with an email address if people want to take things up.